Hello, and today we're going to be talking about while loops again. Last video we covered the basic idea of what a while loop is, which allows you to loop through chunks of code until a condition becomes false. But now we're going to take this a little further, and we're going to go through just another example that shows you more of the power of while loops and where you can actually use them. So let's just take a look at a better example here. So we're going to create a program, and this program is going to take a series of marks, and then with these series of marks it's going to tell you the average of all the marks you entered. The only thing is we don't know how many marks the user is going to enter. The only thing we do know is they can enter marks until they enter in -1 to say that nope, we're done entering marks. So the idea is they can keep typing in 60, 80, 100 until they get -1, and then it will give you the average at the end of that. So to do this, we need to start by having a simple double variable which is going to store our average. Finally, we're going to have a total marks section. So this is basically going to just hold the total of all the marks that we're going to read in. And so it's just going to count up every time we get a mark. The last variable we're going to need is we're going to need a number of marks, and this just simply keeps track of the number of marks that they've entered. So as you know from an average, you can total up all of the things you want to average and then divide them by the number of things that you are averaging. So these are two numbers here that we can just divide to get our average. The last thing we will need is just a temporary variable to store the input. We're just going to make a new variable called current mark. And so the current mark is just going to store the current mark they entered. So let's just do a little intro here and say, welcome to our mark average calculator. So now that we have our welcome, we have to start thinking about how we're going to do this. So the first thing we'll need to do is read in a mark. We are going to do our scanf here, and we're going to read in our integer, and this is just going to be our current mark. So now we have our current mark here that they've entered. And the idea now is that until they enter in -1, we can keep adding this mark on. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a while loop, and this while loop will simply say while the current mark doesn't equal -1. So that means that this while loop is going to repeat as long as we have a valid current mark. So once we are in the while loop, at the beginning of the while loop, we know that at this point we have a valid mark, and so now we can process that mark. And so to process it, all we have to do is we have to add to our total marks. So we're going to go total marks, and then we're going to go equal to total marks plus current mark. Now right away on the first situation here, it's going to just add to something random because we never actually initialized this to 0. So let's do that. And we also have to make sure that we initialize our number of marks to 0. So now that we have our total marks, we just need to increase our number of marks here just by 1, and that's just our increment operator, which just simply adds 1 to the number of marks. So we are just incrementing this number of marks, so now this will be equal to 1 mark. So we have that. Now that we've done that, they can enter in another mark. And depending on the value of this mark, if it's -1, it'll simply leave this while loop and leave the program, or it'll come back, loop around, and then add that to our total marks and our number of marks. So we're going to do another scanf, and it's just going to do the exact same thing. And if you are paying attention, like me, you would realize that we forgot our ampersands in our scanf, otherwise the scanf won't work. And so now we have our total marks and our number of marks, and that's all the values. So in theory, when we leave this while loop, we will have two values. We will have the total marks, the addition, all of the marks they've entered totaled together, and we'll also have our number of marks. So with those two values, we can calculate the average from them. So we're going to go average equals, and then we are going to say total marks divided by number of marks. Now, if you recall from one of our introduction videos, this will do integer division because we both have integers here. So what we have to do is we have to tell total marks to become a double temporarily, so that way when we do the division, we get a double or a decimal number back. So I'm just going to put in front of it, in brackets, double, to say, hey, take our total marks and turn itself into a double while we're using it here. So that way we can divide correctly and we'll get a nice little average here. Now let's actually print out our answer here. So the average is, and then we will do our standard output here of our float, our long float, or our double here. And let's add our new line. Let's compile and let's see what happens. So it says, welcome to our mark average calculator, and we didn't prompt them for a number, but as the programmer we know, we should actually ask them to enter in the numbers. But for now, we're going to enter in, let's enter in a grade of 50, 100, 75, and 95, and then it will just keep asking until we hit -1, and then it will give us the average of 80, which is completely correct. Let's just do another test. And let's just give it two close numbers. So we're going to give it 100, and we're going to give it 99, and that's it. So we give it that, and that will give us 99.5. So you can see that no matter how many numbers we enter in here, it'll keep going until we enter -1. And then at -1, it will say, oh, we're done getting marks. Now we can actually finally calculate the average and print it out. So here's an interesting situation. What happens if we just write -1 right away? Now, it gave us something weird here. It said the average is NaN. And what NaN actually means is not a number. And the reason why it said not a number is because if we look at our program here, we started with total marks as 0, number of marks is 0, and then we read in our current mark, which actually has to be -1. So we skip this entire while loop and go to calculate our average. And at this point, our average is actually 0, and here's the key part, divided by 0. And as we know, we can't divide by 0, so it's said that this is not a number. This is not a valid number stored within the average. So the easy way to do this is simply say, if we have some numbers, so if we at least have one number, so meaning our number of marks is greater than 0. So if we have a number, then we can calculate and print out our average. Otherwise, we can tell them that you did not enter any marks. So we can simply say that we didn't enter any marks, and let's put our return at the end here just to make it a complete program. And now we have a program which does some checks to make sure that we're not dividing by 0. So now if we actually just enter a -1 right away, it says you did not enter any marks. But if you do enter some marks, like even just one mark, it'll give you the right value because it detects to see that we actually have some marks before we try and divide by 0. So that's just an example of a while loop where you actually, it's a good situation because you don't know how many times they want to loop, and you just loop as long as the user wants you to loop and keep asking for marks.